And without further ado, I would introduce, jump to our next session. So as I already mentioned in my opening, that as someone studying forest policy, I know that usually after the first 5 minutes, you can get quite confused with the complexity of the field. But however, in this first session, we are challenging and inviting Professor Bas Arts to explain the whole of forestry field to us in the next 15 minutes in a way that is not too overwhelming. Professor Dr. Bas Arts holds a personal chair in forest governance at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Arts holds a master in biology and PhD in policy sciences and public administration. Currently, his research and teaching focus on international forest biodiversity and climate change governance, local natural resource management, and their interconnections. Professor Arts, if it's an impossible task not to overwhelm people with forest policy, that's okay. But with this presentation, please do give us some hope at least to get over the overwhelm. The title of the session is International Forest Policy, Setting the Scene. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alina, for introducing me. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor for me to do this keynote on this Youth Forest Policy Day. I really feel honored, and I hope not to be too overwhelming. First, let me share my presentation with you. Okay, the title is Setting the Scene, so I'll try in 15 minutes to set the scene. Next slide, please. And I do that in two parts. I start with mapping of international forest policy and governance, and a very short evaluation. Next slide, please. So I don't think I need to introduce all the forest-related problems we are facing today: deforestation, forest degradation, marginalization of forest-dependent people. And we see expansion of agriculture, of cities, of mining, of logging, and particularly so related to climate change, wild forest fires. Next slide. But the big question here is, can forest governance make a difference? And I'll try to give a bit of an answer in my next, let's say, 12 minutes, which is still there. Next slide, please. Okay, what's governance? Governance comes from the Greek word kubernan, and it means actually piloting, steering, or director. And on the right, you see a more classical image from, I guess, Greek philosophy. But in the next slide, we see a much more modern image, and that's the image of the cockpit of a plane. And this metaphor is often used for governance, for steering. And it's even taken very literally in some practices, and that's shown in the next slide. Here you see a map of the city center of Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil. And this was designed and built in the 50s and 60s as a new capital. And the interesting thing, it was designed in the shape of an airplane. And in the cockpit of that airplane, which is shown in the next slide, there the ministries, the palace of the president and the parliament are located. So you see that this image of a cockpit of piloting is taken very literally in practice sometimes. And it's shown that a government needs to steer the society into a direction which is positive for the society. Economic growth, welfare, sustainable development, you name it. In the next slide, there's one of the definition which is often used for governance, which is formulated by Pierre and Peters. And for them, governance is the capacity of government to make and implement policy, in other words, to steer society. And again, this word of steering is coming back. But he also used the term of policy. Next slide, please. And what's the difference? This is a very simple distinction. So policy is the what. is about planning, about timelines and objectives, and governance is about the how you come from plan to practice. And here the steering by governments is very important. Next slide, please. But the idea that governments are only responsible and doing governance is a bit outdated. So there's an old governance and a new one. And therefore, I add to the definition of Pierre and Peters the terminology of non-governmental organizations. So today, there's much more than before that governments, together with non-governmental organizations, make and implement policy, in other words, steer society. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, you have governance by the state, but you also have governance with or without the state. Next slide, please. But how does that work? How does a government, but today also non-state actors, steer society? They do that through all kinds of instruments. Next slide, please. First of all, law and regulations. And of course, you know that. And these can be binding and non-binding. Secondly, through incentives, so subsidies for a kind of behavior that governments would like to facilitate, or through fines if they try to avoid certain behavior bias. And the third instrument is communication and education. And maybe you have heard of the terminology carrots and sticks. That's often used to talk about these instruments. But you also have the so-called sermons. The carrots are then the incentives, the sticks are the law and regulations, and the sermons are the communication. But there are more instruments and also more recent ones. Next slide, please. Governments also use more physical means to steer our behavior, so to control the flow. For example, they use spatial planning to control the expansion of cities, for example, or they have infrastructure to control the flow of mobility. Since 25 years, you also have these so-called market-based instruments. And you can think about payment for ecosystem services, you might have heard of that, but also labeling schemes like a forest certification. I'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, the so-called nudges. This is very popular today. And the idea is that, that through changing the context in which consumers and citizens make choices, to change that. Think, for example, about the supermarket. Where are the products located? Are the ones up front which are unhealthy, like the sweets and other things, or are these the very healthy fruits and nuts? In this way, also our behavior is influenced. And of course, this is about supermarkets and maybe self-regulations, but governments are very much also facilitating the self-regulation by supermarkets, for example. Next slide, please. But in the end, it's all about instrument mixes. In nearly all cases, combinations of these different instruments are used. Now I make the change to international forest policy and governance because all these instruments are used there as well. Next slide, please. With one exception, by the way, we don't have an international treaty on forest. There were many attempts to have one, all kinds of international negotiations, but they somehow failed. What we do have is non-legally binding instruments. And the most famous one, you could say, is the non-legally binding instrument, NLBI, on all types of forest. Actually, if you read it, it's a kind of international treaty, but its status is non-legally binding. I don't have the time to get into it, why it's only non-legally binding, but maybe during the Q&A we can go into that. But there are other non-legally binding instruments. You also have the UN Strategic Plan on Forest, including 6 global forest goals. These are, for example, about curbing the trend of deforestation and even halting it in 2030. At least that's the ambition. It's about sustainable forest management, forest protection, mobilization of additional financial means, inclusive governance, and international cooperation. These are the global forest goals. But what we does see, because we don't have legally binding treaties, there's a dominance of communicative instruments, of discernments. Next slide, please. But on top of that, we also have governmental pledges and funds, about hundreds of millions of dollars a year. From the Global Environmental Fund, there's climate finance, but also finance for the forest and landscape restoration, which comes from the bond challenge. We also have some market-based instruments. RED Plus, you might heard of it. It's a kind of payment for ecosystem services, not literally, but at least the ambition was to have an international payment for ecosystem services scheme. But we also see forest certification. So certifying of sustainable forest management on the forest floor on the one hand, but also in value chain. And you might have heard of FSC and PFC. These are forest certification. Next slide, please. But of course, where do these instruments come from? We do have a lot of international organizations that do relate to forest issues. Of course, the FAO, and then the Committee on Forestry. But we also see the United Nations Forum on Forest, which comes from the 90s, and which is maybe the core now of international governance of forest. And we do have the Collaborative Partnership on Forest. Sorry for all the acronyms, but at least I try not to be overwhelming, but to show you the core of international forest policy and governance. Next slide, please. Some others have tried to map this international system of forest governance and forest policy. And they counted about 50 international organizations / instruments that together form this system. And in the center of it are the UNFF, United Nations Forum on Forest, and this Collaborative Partnership on Forest. And they together are sometimes also called International Arrangements on Forest, IAF. This is the core, let's say, of forest governance internationally. But there are also many international arenas and topics which relate to forest. You can think about biodiversity, about human rights, climate change, sustainable development, trade, you name it. So it's a very complex system. But again, in the core, you have these forest-specific organizations and instruments. Next slide, please. Okay, Forest Europe is also the co-organizer of this important event. And therefore, I have one slide on them. They also contributed to this international system of forest policy and governance, particularly on three things: the definition and criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management. They also helped to think about a European approach for the national forest programs. And the idea of national forest programs also stems from this UNFF, the United Nations Forum on Forest. And they also were involved in negotiating a legal instrument, a legally binding instrument on forest for Europe. This is still pending, by the way, but they took the initiative. Next slide, please. Okay, some evaluation. Next slide. About 5 years ago, together with colleagues, we looked at the literature about global forest governance and also looked how different authors not only differently interpreted this complex system, but also evaluated it differently. So here you see some critical comments that, well, we do see all these instruments, but they are only symbolic and they don't really address the underlying causes. That's what some author claims. Some others in the next slide, they are a bit more positive. And they say, hey, yes, we do see some differences on the ground. So I decided to do some evaluation myself together with colleagues, and that's shown in the next slide. So I tried to evaluate some of these new governance arrangements and initiatives. Next slide, please. The first is about governance modes, and this is the different ways in which states and non-state actors, governments and non-governmental organizations work together on forest issues. And one example in this field, the next please, is the EU Flag T Action Plan. Yes, it's an initiative of the European Union to combat illegal logging and also to ban illegal timber from the markets. But if you see how it's implemented, it's a multi-stakeholder approach. Next slide, please. I also looked at so-called governance shifts. And in many cases, it's not governments that regulate certain issues, but it is non-state actors. And what you see is a shift of power and authority from the state to non-state actors. And one example is the self-regulation through forest certifications. Next slide, please. And here you see the two main schemes. BFC, and FSC in the slide. Next one, please. And a third and final governance arrangement I looked at is through governance norms. And here it is that states also have norms, criteria for good governance. And one is that they have to, or at least they are invited to let non-state actors, non-governmental actors also to participate in governmental policy. And one example in the next slide is then participatory forest management. Well, if you take these three initiatives together, next slide, please. And also next slide, please. Then one conclusion of my evaluation is, yes, these three in different ways contribute to these global forest goals. And the second conclusion, next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Previous slide. Somehow something disappeared in this red box. But what it says is that these three initiatives together reach about 1.4 billion hectares worldwide, which is nearly 1/3 of all forests worldwide. This is quite impressive. However, not everywhere these initiatives are well implemented or even not implemented. And for as far as they are implemented, and that's what we learned from many impact studies around the world, I looked at some systematic reviews, 7 in total, more than 100 assessments, representing millions of hectares. We can say that about half of these initiatives do indeed produce some positive effects on the ground, either ecologically or socio-economically. So let me move now to the take-home messages. So 1, policy is about the what, governance is about the how. And how do you then steer society? Yes, you have these carrots, sticks, and sermons, and also some other instruments. I also looked in my talk about new governance arrangement through these modes, cooperation between states and non-states, the shifts, so that non-state actors themselves through self-regulation work on governance issues, and finally norms, so the good governance. About the evaluation, international forest governance is often considered weak in the literature, but what I also try to show in my own publications is that case studies do show that we do see some effectiveness on the ground. FLEGT certification, BFM. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.